The diner was small, the kind of place where the smell of coffee never left the air, where the sound of dishes clinking against each other mixed with tired conversations of people who stopped by for a cheap meal. The waitress worked there every day from morning until night. Her name was not known to many, because for most people she was just the girl who refilled their cups and smiled politely even when her feet were aching. She lived in a tiny rented room a few blocks away, where the paint was peeling and the rent always felt heavier than her paycheck. Yet every morning she tied her hair back, put on the faded uniform, and told herself to get through one more day. Her life was not easy. She was young but carried the weight of many worries. Her father had passed away years ago, her mother lived far away in the countryside with health problems, and the waitress sent her part of her small income every month, sometimes skipping her own meals just to make sure her mother had medicine. The tips she earned depended on the mood of the customers. Some days they were generous, other days they barely left coins, and she often returned home with empty pockets and a hungry stomach, but she never let her pain show on her face while working, because she believed her job was not only to serve food, but also to bring a little comfort to strangers who came through the door. The diner itself was not glamorous. The neon sign outside flickered half the time. The booths had torn leather seats patched with tape, and the floor had lost its shine long ago. But it was a place where truck drivers, lonely old men, tired students and busy workers came in, and each face told its own story. The waitress had learned to read moods quickly. She could tell when someone wanted to be left alone with their thoughts, or when a friendly word might lift their spirit. In a way, she was more than just a server. She was a silent companion to people who passed by. Still, when the shift was long, her body hurt, her shoes were cheap and worn out, and blisters covered her heels. She sometimes leaned against the counter in the kitchen when no one was looking, just to rest for a second. Her hands smelled of dish soap and fried food even after washing them again and again. She dreamed of a different life, maybe one where she could study further or open her own small bakery, but such dreams always felt too far away. She was stuck in a cycle where survival mattered more than ambition, and yet, she carried herself with quiet strength, never giving up. The waitress had grown used to all kinds of customers. Some were kind and thanked her warmly. Others were rude and snapped their fingers as if she were invisible. She had learned not to take it personally, though sometimes at night she would replay harsh words in her head and wonder why people chose cruelty when kindness was free. She often reminded herself of her father's words from long ago. He used to tell her that no matter how poor they were, they should never let poverty steal their goodness, and she tried to live by that every single day. Her co-workers were few. The cook in the back was an older man who barely spoke except to shout when orders piled up. Another part-time waitress covered the night shift, but most of the time she was on her own, balancing trays, pouring coffee, and keeping her smile even when exhaustion tugged at her. Sometimes she felt invisible, like no one in the world saw her struggle, but she never complained, because complaining would not pay the bills. Instead, she just worked harder, telling herself that something better might come one day. That particular week had been especially hard. The rent was due, her shoes were torn even more, and her mother had called asking for help with new medicine. She had promised to send money, though she had no idea how. She skipped lunch to save a little and told herself she would be fine. Yet inside her chest there was a constant tightness, a fear of failing, a fear of being too poor to care for the only family she had left. But she never allowed her face to show that sadness when she stood in front of customers. She practiced smiling even in the mirror, because she knew people came to the diner not only to eat but to feel a little warmth in the middle of their busy lives. It was on one of those long days, when her shift seemed endless and her body begged for rest, that she noticed something different. Outside the glass window she saw a figure sitting quietly, his clothes dirty, his face tired, clearly someone who had been living on the streets. Most people passing by looked at him with judgment or pity, but she saw the hunger in his eyes, and something inside her stirred. She knew too well what it meant to be hungry, to go without food, though she had never been on the streets. She understood that kind of pain. Her heart softened immediately, and though she had been warned by the manager before not to waste food, a thought began to form in her mind. The waitress could not know in that moment how important her choice would be. She could not know that a simple plate of leftovers would change the course of her entire life. For her it was just instinct, just kindness that came naturally. She did not see herself as a hero. She was just a poor girl trying to do what was right. But destiny had been watching quietly, waiting for the moment when her goodness would shine through the hardest of times, and that moment was about to come closer than she ever imagined. The man sat outside the diner, his back leaning against the wall. His clothes were torn and covered in dirt. His shoes had holes, and his hair looked messy as if he had not seen a comb in months. His eyes were heavy with tiredness, yet behind them there was something deeper, something that told of long days and cold nights, the kind of look only people who had been forgotten by society carried. He watched people pass by. Most of them glanced at him for a moment and then quickly turned their heads away, as if pretending he was invisible would make their world easier. Some even wrinkled their noses in disgust, holding their bags closer as though he were a danger instead of a starving soul. He had been coming around that street for a few days, never asking for money directly, sometimes just sitting quietly, sometimes searching the trash bins for leftover scraps of food. The city was cruel to those who had nothing, and every day for him was a battle between hunger and shame. He was not loud like some beggars who shouted for coins. He was quiet, almost proud, though the truth of his empty stomach betrayed him. His thin frame and shaking hands showed clearly that he had not eaten a proper meal in a long time, yet no one cared enough to stop. Inside the diner, the waitress noticed him again and again. Every time she passed by the window, she saw him still sitting there, sometimes staring at the menu board outside even though he knew he had no money, sometimes lowering his head as people walked past. She felt something stir in her chest. It was not pity exactly. It was more like recognition. She knew what it meant to go without. She knew what it felt like to hope for kindness and find only silence. Her heart whispered that this man did not deserve to be ignored, not tonight, not while she was there. Customers inside were not so kind. A pair of businessmen sitting by the window looked out and muttered about how the neighborhood was going down. One woman whispered loudly enough for others to hear that the man should be moved away before he scared people off. A group of teenagers laughed as they pointed at his old shoes. The sound of their mocking voices reached the waitress and made her fists tighten at her side. She wanted to tell them to stop, but she knew her job was fragile. One wrong word and her manager would send her home without pay. So she bit her tongue and carried on with her duties, though her heart stayed restless. The homeless man finally stood, his steps weak, and he pushed open the diner's glass door. The bell above rang, and suddenly all eyes turned to him. The chatter grew quiet. Forks paused mid-air. The manager behind the counter narrowed his eyes as if preparing to throw him out. The smell of food must have pulled him in. He looked around nervously, as if expecting to be shouted at. His voice when he finally spoke was soft, almost broken. He asked if he could just have a glass of water. Nothing else, just water. The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that makes the air heavy. The waitress stepped forward quickly before anyone else could answer. She smiled gently and nodded, bringing him a glass of cold water. He whispered thank you and held it in both hands as though it were a treasure. He drank slowly, stretching the moment. The other customers rolled their eyes, some shook their heads, and one man muttered that he should be removed, but the waitress ignored them. Something about the stranger touched her deeply. He was not begging for money. He was not demanding anything. He was simply thirsty, simply tired, simply human. When she went back to the counter, her eyes drifted to the plates of half-eaten food left by customers who had just paid and left. The rules were clear. The food should be thrown away, but her heart argued against waste, especially when a man sat only a few steps away with nothing in his stomach. She hesitated. Her mind filled with worry about what the manager might say, but her conscience was louder. She picked up one of the plates, added a little extra from the kitchen without telling anyone, and carried it quietly to his table, setting it down before him with a soft smile. The man looked up at her, his eyes widening in surprise. He shook his head at first, as if he did not believe it was meant for him. His lips trembled. His hands hovered above the food. She encouraged him with a small nod, and finally he lowered his head, whispering words of gratitude so low that only she could hear. Then he began to eat, slowly at first, as though savoring every bite. Then with hunger too strong to hold back, tears gathered in the corners of his eyes as he chewed. The other customers stared, some with disgust, some with pity, but the waitress only saw a man who had been hungry for too long. As he ate, she stood nearby pretending to wipe tables, but in truth she was watching, making sure no one disturbed him. She saw how carefully he used the fork and knife, how even in his state he tried to keep manners. He ate as though the food was more than just nourishment. It was dignity. It was proof that he still belonged to the world. Her heart ached and yet felt lighter at the same time, because she had done what was right, even if no one else approved. The manager eventually noticed and frowned, calling her aside sharply. He scolded her for wasting food, warned her that the diner was not a charity, told her that if she repeated such behavior she might lose her job. The waitress lowered her head, apologizing softly, though in her heart she did not regret it at all. She would have done it again, because kindness was worth more than rules. Kindness was worth more than fear. The homeless man finished his meal and stood slowly, his eyes meeting hers one last time. He whispered another thank you, this time with more strength. Then he walked out into the night, leaving the diner buzzing with whispers and judgmental glances. But the waitress did not care. She had seen something in his eyes that no one else had bothered to notice. A spark of gratitude. A hint of hope, and though she did not know it yet, that simple moment would return to her in ways she could never imagine. A storm of destiny had begun to move quietly around her. All because she chose to feed a hungry man when the rest of the world turned away. The night was quieter than usual. The hum of the old ceiling fan and the clatter of dishes from the back kitchen filled the air. The waitress stood near the counter wiping glasses, but her thoughts were far from her work. She kept thinking of the man who had just left, the way he held the glass of water as if it was a gift, the way his hands shook when she placed the food before him, and most of all, the way his eyes had softened when she gave him a smile instead of a frown. She knew she had done something against the rules, but in her heart she felt no guilt, only a strange warmth. The man had eaten every bite slowly, with respect, as though each piece of bread, each spoonful, was more than food. It was dignity, and that was what moved her the most, because she knew hunger, not the hunger of the streets, but the hunger of choosing to eat less so her mother could have medicine. The hunger of going to bed with tea instead of dinner. So when she saw his gratitude, it touched her deeper than she could explain. It was as if their lives, though worlds apart, had met for a brief moment through kindness. Around her, whispers continued. A few customers talked in low voices, saying she was foolish to waste food on someone who would never give her anything in return. Some even laughed and said she probably just wanted to look like a hero. But their words slid off her shoulders. She did not do it for praise. She did not even do it for the man's thanks. She did it because something inside her refused to watch another human suffer when she had the chance to help. That was enough for her. Later that evening, when the last customer had left and the chairs were stacked on tables, the manager spoke to her again, his voice sharp, warning her that such behavior could not be repeated. He said the diner was a business, not a shelter, and if she wanted to give food to strangers, she should do it with her own money. She nodded quietly, agreeing out loud though her heart disagreed completely. She needed this job too much to argue, but inside she thought what harm could come from giving. Leftovers that were going to the trash anyway. Rules seemed so cold compared to kindness. On her way home that night, she walked slowly under the dim streetlights. The city buzzed with cars and voices, but she felt strangely calm. She thought about the man's eyes when they met hers, eyes that carried both pain and gratitude, and she wondered where he would sleep that night. She wondered if the little meal she gave him would give him strength to face tomorrow. She even wished she could do more, but her own pockets were nearly empty. She barely had enough to pay her rent, so all she could offer was what she had at the diner. Still, it gave her a sense of peace, knowing she had not turned away. The next day, she came back to work as usual, tying her hair back, putting on her worn uniform, pretending that nothing unusual had happened. Yet inside she carried a secret, a memory of the man's soft thank you, and it made her smile more warmly at her morning customers. She poured coffee, served plates of eggs and toast, and each time she passed the window she glanced outside, half expecting to see him again. But he was not there. The spot where he had sat looked empty, and she wondered if he had moved on to another street, or if hunger had carried him somewhere far. Days passed and she saw glimpses of him at times, sitting on the same corner, always quiet, never causing trouble, never asking for coins. Once she thought she saw him look toward the diner and hesitate, as though he wanted to come back in. But then he lowered his head and stayed outside. Perhaps he was too ashamed. Perhaps he did not want to bring her more trouble. Still, the thought of him lingered with her through every shift, through every tired night. She remembered the way he held that plate of food as if it meant the world, and it reminded her why she must never let her own hardships harden her heart. The other waitresses joked about him behind her back, saying she had found herself a new friend. But she ignored their laughter. Kindness was not a joke, it was a choice, and she had chosen it. Maybe the man would never come back. Maybe he would disappear like many faces in the crowd. But she felt that moment between them was important, almost like a seed planted in the soil of her life. She did not know if it would grow, or if it would wither. But she could not forget it. The homeless man, too, carried that night with him, though she did not know it. He walked through the city with a new thought in his heart. A thought that maybe not everyone had forgotten him. Maybe there was still kindness in the world. He remembered her smile, her quiet courage, and it lit a small flame inside him. A flame he had not felt in a long time. One meal, one act of kindness, had changed the way he saw himself. It reminded him that he was still human, still worthy of compassion. And it gave him a strength he thought he had lost forever. Back at the diner, the waitress continued her work, never expecting anything in return, never knowing that destiny was quietly shifting around her. She believed it was just one small act of goodness, a plate of food, a glass of water, but sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Sometimes kindness is like a pebble thrown into a pond, sending ripples that spread far beyond what the eye can see. She had no idea that the ripples she created would soon return to her, not as a whisper, not as a thank you, but as a storm that would shake her life in ways she could not even imagine. And so the waitress worked, and the homeless man disappeared into the city's shadows. Yet their paths were tied together now, bound by a single act that seemed so small, yet was greater than either of them understood. It was the kind of moment that destiny watches closely, waiting for the right time to reveal its secret. And that time was coming, sooner than she thought, hidden behind ordinary days and silent nights, waiting to burst into her world with a power that would leave her. Breathless, the diner was never completely quiet. Even on slow afternoons there were always sounds, the hiss of the coffee machine, the clinking of forks and knives, the creak of the old door when someone came in. But after the night the waitress gave food to the homeless man, a new sound filled the place. It was the low hum of whispers, customers leaning across their booths, speaking in voices meant to be secret but sharp enough to reach her ears. Some said she was soft-hearted. Others said she was foolish. A few even laughed and claimed she had wasted good food on someone who would never matter. The words swirled around her like smoke, sometimes stinging, sometimes heavy, but she kept her head down and worked as if she had not heard. She noticed the way people's eyes followed her now, as though she had done something shocking, even though to her it had been simple. A man was hungry, and she gave him food. Yet in the diner it had become a story, a tale told from one table to another, each person twisting it into their own version. Some admired her, saying not many would risk their job to show kindness, but others muttered that she was careless, that she should focus on her work instead of strangers. The waitress pretended not to care, but inside she felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. The manager was the loudest critic, his face red with frustration as he called her into the back. He reminded her that the diner was a business, not a charity. He warned her that if word spread that beggars were welcome, the customers would leave. He said food cost money, even leftovers, and she had no right to give them away. She stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her apron, nodding at the right times, not because she agreed, but because she could not afford to lose this job still. Her heart rebelled against his words, because she knew kindness should never be treated as a mistake. When she stepped back into the dining room, she felt the stares again. One old woman smiled at her softly as if to say she understood. But at the next table a man sneered and whispered something cruel to his wife. The waitress forced her smile, pouring coffee, clearing plates, doing her duties as if nothing had changed. But inside she felt torn. Part of her wanted to stand tall and tell them that feeding a hungry man was never wrong, and another part of her reminded her of her mother waiting, far away, of the rent that was due, of the bills stacked like bricks on her tiny table at home. She could not risk everything for pride, so she swallowed the words and kept moving. The gossip grew over the next few days. Even people who had not been in the diner that night seemed to know. A truck driver joked about it when he came in, asking if the waitress was running a soup kitchen now. Two young girls giggled when they saw her, whispering behind their menus. The sound of their laughter stuck in her ears. Yet she served them politely, her smile unwavering, though deep down she wished people could see past their own judgment and understand that one act of kindness was not weakness but strength. The homeless man himself did not return during those days, and his absence only added to the whispers. Some said he had probably taken her food and disappeared, proving he was not worth the trouble. Others said maybe he had been arrested or moved to another street. She wondered too. Every time she looked through the diner window and saw the empty corner outside, her chest tightened with worry. She hoped he was safe. She hoped at least the food had given him enough strength to face the cold nights. She did not regret her choice, no matter what anyone said, but she wished people could stop turning kindness into gossip. At night, when her shift ended and she walked home under the flickering streetlights, the words of the customers followed her. Like echoes she could not escape. She remembered her father's advice from long ago, that people would always talk, no matter what you did, and that the only thing that mattered was whether you could sleep peacefully knowing you had done right. Those words comforted her, but still, she was human, and the weight of being judged made her heart ache. She lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the homeless man's eyes, the way they had lit up when she brought him food, and that memory was enough to make her smile even in the silence of the night. The manager's warnings grew sharper with each passing day. Once when she carried a plate of leftovers to the back, he barked at her not to even think about giving food away again. She nodded quickly, promising she wouldn't, but in her heart she knew that if the man returned hungry, she would not be able to stop herself. She could accept punishment, she could accept whispers, but she could not accept watching someone suffer when she could help, and that stubborn spark inside her refused to die. Then something strange began to happen. Though the gossip had started as cruel, a few regular customers began to change their tone. One old man who came in every morning for coffee and eggs told her quietly that he thought she was brave. A young mother smiled and said she hoped someone would show her child the same kindness if he were ever in need. Even the cook in the back, who rarely spoke more than a few words, gave her a nod one evening, a silent gesture of respect. It gave her strength. It reminded her that not everyone judged harshly, that kindness had its quiet supporters too. And so the days continued, filled with whispers and stares, filled with warnings from the manager, filled with her own silent battle between fear and compassion. She carried on as if nothing had changed, yet inside she knew everything had changed, because one act of kindness had placed her under a light she never asked for. People had noticed her, people had judged her, but destiny had also noticed, quietly, in the shadows, preparing something far greater than the whispers of a diner. Something she could not yet see, but something that was already moving toward her life with unstoppable steps. The morning started like any other. The waitress tied her hair back, put on her faded uniform, and walked to the diner with heavy eyes. The sky was cloudy and gray. The streets were busy with people rushing to work. She thought the day would be just another long shift filled with endless coffee refills and forced smiles. She did not know that this day would be different. She did not know that something was about to happen that would shake not just the diner but her entire life. Inside, the diner buzzed with its usual noise. The smell of bacon and pancakes filled the air. Truck drivers sat in the corner sipping black coffee. Two mothers shared gossip at a booth while their children picked at plates of fries, and the manager stood behind the counter counting money. Everything felt ordinary, until the sound of engines roared outside. Not the sound of old cars or delivery trucks, but the deep growl of luxury vehicles, sleek black cars with tinted windows, polished until they shone even under the dull sky. The bell above the door had not yet rung, but already heads turned toward the window. The sight outside made people pause mid-bite. 3 black cars parked neatly in front of the diner. Their doors opened smoothly, and men in dark suits stepped out, their movements sharp and professional. They wore sunglasses even though the sun was hidden behind clouds, and small earpieces glimmered in their ears. The air inside the diner grew heavy. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered in the air. People whispered words like guards, security, important. Nobody knew who they were waiting for, but it was clear they were not ordinary visitors. The door finally opened with a creak, and 2 guards walked in first, their eyes scanning the room carefully. Every customer felt the weight of their gaze. Even the waitress froze for a moment, her heart thumping fast. The guards did not order food. They did not sit. They simply looked around as though measuring every corner of the small diner. Then, as the room held its breath, another figure appeared in the doorway, and the waitress's eyes widened in shock. It was him, the homeless man, the same man she had given leftovers to. But he looked so different now that for a second she wondered if her mind was playing tricks. His face was clean. His hair trimmed neatly. His clothes crisp and new. A well-tailored suit that fit him perfectly. He walked with confidence, shoulders straight, step steady. Nothing like the trembling figure who had asked for a glass of water, yet she recognized his eyes immediately. The same tired eyes, but now filled with a quiet strength. A spark of life that had been hidden before. Gasps filled the diner. Customers exchanged confused glances. Some muttered in disbelief. How could this man, who days ago looked like a beggar, now arrive with luxury cars and bodyguards? The manager's jaw nearly dropped. He rubbed his eyes as if trying to clear an illusion. The waitress stood frozen by the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She could not understand what she was seeing, but deep inside her chest she felt a strange pull, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally come. The man walked further inside, his guards staying close but giving him space. His eyes searched the room until they landed on her, the waitress who had shown him kindness when no one else would. His lips curved into a faint smile, gentle but full of meaning. He nodded once as if to reassure her that this was real, that he had not forgotten. The diner was silent, only the sound of the ceiling fan turning slowly above. Every person inside waited for him to speak, waited to understand why he was there. The waitress's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the whispers of the customers, the scolding of the manager, the loneliness of defending kindness in a world that did not care. And now, here he was, standing tall, no longer invisible, no longer a man people could mock. He looked like someone important, someone powerful. Yet his eyes softened only when they looked at her, and in that gaze she felt the truth. He had returned not for the food, not for the diner, but for her. The manager hurried forward, his voice nervous and shaky, welcoming the man as if he were a famous guest, offering him a table, but the man ignored him gently. His steps carried him straight to the counter where the waitress stood. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, the memory of that night between them filling the silence. She remembered his trembling hands, and now she saw them steady. She remembered his quiet whisper of thank you, and now she heard the strength in his voice as he greeted her. People inside the diner whispered louder. Some guessed he was a businessman. Some said he must be a politician. Others wondered if he was a celebrity in disguise. But none of their guesses mattered. What mattered was the moment unfolding before their eyes. A poor waitress and a man who had seemed forgotten by the world. Now standing face to face under the curious gaze of an entire diner, it felt unreal, like a scene from a story, yet every heartbeat reminded her it was real. The waitress wanted to ask 100 questions. Where had he gone? Who was he really? Why had he returned? But her voice was caught in her throat. She could only stand there, her hands clutching her apron, her heart pounding so loudly she feared others could hear. The man looked at her with a softness that silenced her fears. He had not forgotten her kindness, and whatever his story was, he had come back to show her that kindness never goes unnoticed. The diner, once filled with gossip and judgment, was now filled with shock and silence. The same people who had mocked her for wasting food now stared in disbelief. The same manager who scolded her now forced a smile at the man he once wanted to throw out. Everything had shifted in a single moment. The air itself felt different, heavy with curiosity, heavy with the weight of something extraordinary. And so the homeless man who was no longer homeless stood there with guards behind him and power in his presence. And the waitress who once thought her kindness was small realized it had started something far greater. She did not yet know the truth. She did not yet know what he would say. But deep inside she felt that her life was about to change forever. The ordinary walls of the diner would soon witness a story that no one would ever forget. The diner was frozen in silence. Every pair of eyes followed the man in the suit as he stood near the counter. The guards behind him stood tall like statues, their dark glasses hiding their eyes. Their presence alone made the room feel smaller, heavier. People barely breathed. Forks rested untouched on plates. Even the old neon sign outside seemed to stop buzzing for a moment. The waitress felt her legs grow weak under her. Her heart raced as she stared at the man she once thought was homeless, now looking like someone from another world. He looked at her with calm eyes, not cold, but full of meaning, the kind of look that carried weight, as if he had come with a purpose. He spoke her name softly, his voice clear and steady. The sound surprised her. because she could not remember ever telling him her name. Yet somehow he knew. The customers gasped quietly. The manager blinked in confusion, wondering how this stranger knew the poor waitress by name. The man smiled faintly, then turned to the room filled with curious stares. "I was not what I seemed," he began, his voice gentle but firm. Every person leaned closer, as if afraid to miss a single word. He explained that when the waitress had first seen him outside, he had been dressed like a homeless man, sitting on the cold street, ignored by most. But the truth was different. He had not been truly homeless. He had been walking through the city in disguise, wanting to see the world through another lens, to see how people treated someone with nothing. He had wanted to test humanity, to test kindness, and it was in that test that he had met her. Gasps spread across the diner. Forks clinked against plates. Whispers began to rise like ripples of water. People exchanged glances. Some looked shocked, some skeptical. But no one could deny the truth standing before them. The man continued. He explained that he was not only wealthy, but one of the richest men in the city, perhaps even in the country. His fortune was hidden behind companies and investments, and the guards outside were his security team. They protected him wherever he went. But on that night when he sat hungry outside the diner, he had dismissed them, choosing to appear like a man with nothing, just to see how the world would react. The waitress felt her breath catch. Her mind tried to understand his words. The man she had given leftovers to, the man who had whispered thank you with trembling lips, was a billionaire. She remembered the way he held the glass of water, the way his hands shook over a plate of food, the way people mocked him, and now, realizing the truth, her chest tightened. She thought of all the whispers, all the cruel laughter from customers, and now she saw their faces turning pale with shame. The manager stepped forward quickly, forcing a smile, his voice suddenly sweet, welcoming the man as though he had always been a valued guest. But the man raised his hand calmly, silencing him. He looked at the waitress again, his eyes softening. When no one else cared, he said, "You chose to see me as a human being. You gave me food. You gave me dignity. You reminded me that kindness still exists in a world that often forgets it." His words made her throat tighten. Tears burned in her eyes, because she had never expected her small act to matter this much. Around the diner, people sat in stunned silence. Some lowered their heads in guilt, remembering how they had whispered or laughed. Others looked at the waitress with new respect, realizing that the girl they once ignored had done something powerful, something none of them had. She had passed a test without even knowing it. Her heart had chosen compassion when everyone else had chosen judgment. The man spoke again, explaining how he had wandered the streets for days, seeing how people treated him like dirt, how no one stopped to offer kindness, how the world had turned cold. But in that moment, when she gave him leftovers that were meant for the trash, she gave him more than food. She gave him proof that compassion was still alive. He said it had moved him so deeply that he knew he could not forget her. That was why he had returned, not as the broken man she first met, but as who he truly was, a man with the power to change lives. The waitress's hands trembled. She did not know what to say. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, that she only did what anyone should do, but her lips would not move. She stood there frozen between disbelief and wonder. She thought of her mother waiting far away, of her unpaid bills, of her tired nights walking home alone. And now she realized that a simple act of kindness had brought her to this extraordinary moment, a moment that no amount of planning could have created. The customers could not look away. The young girls who had giggled at her now stared wide-eyed. The businessmen who had mocked the homeless man now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the old truck driver in the corner nodded slowly, as if admitting that he had just witnessed something rare, something true. The diner felt less like a place for meals and more like a stage where destiny had just revealed one of its greatest secrets. The man reached into his pocket, not for money, not for show, but simply to take out a small token, a silver pen. He placed it on the counter before her and said softly, "This is the pen I used to sign my very first company papers. It was the beginning of everything I built, and now I give it to you, because you gave me something that money could not buy, kindness without expectation." His words made her tears fall at last. She held the pen gently, as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world, not because of its price, but because of its meaning. The diner was filled with silence again, but this time it was not judgment. It was awe, The waitress realized then that her life was no longer the same. The man's truth had changed everything, and though she did not yet know what he would do next, she felt that destiny had finally knocked on her door, and the sound of it was louder than the whispers of the world. The pen still rested in her hand, light yet heavy with meaning. Her fingers trembled as she looked at it. The waitress could hardly believe this was happening. She had gone from serving coffee and wiping tables to standing in front of a man who revealed himself as a billionaire. And not just any billionaire, but one who had chosen her kindness as something unforgettable. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Her lips parted, yet no words came out. Her eyes watered as she clutched the pen closer to her chest. The man looked at her with steady eyes, his voice calm and warm as he spoke again. "You gave me dignity when no one else would, and I want to give you something that will change your life." His words rang through the diner like a bell. Customers leaned forward, hearts racing with curiosity. Even the manager, who had once scolded her harshly, now stood frozen, his mouth open, his face pale, unsure of what to say or do. The room was so silent that even the hum of the ceiling fan felt loud. He turned slightly toward his guards, who immediately brought forward a sleek black briefcase. The metallic locks clicked as it opened, and inside were neatly stacked envelopes and papers, the kind of papers that ordinary people rarely touched. Contracts, deeds, checks, promises of wealth. He did not push it toward her yet. Instead he looked at her again. "Tell me," he said gently, "what do you dream of? What is it you wish for when you are alone at night, when the world is quiet and no one is watching? What is it that your heart longs for?" The waitress's lips trembled. She wanted to say she had no dreams, because dreams felt too far away. She had lived only to survive, to pay rent, to send medicine money for her mother, to make it through each long shift. Yet deep inside, hidden under years of struggle, there were wishes she had never dared to speak. She thought of her tiny room, her worn shoes, her aching body, and her tired nights, and then she thought of the bakery she once dreamed of opening, a place filled with the smell of fresh bread, where people came not only to eat but to feel welcome. Her father had once told her she had hands meant to bake, soft hands that made food taste like love. But after he died, she buried that dream beneath hardship. She lowered her head, whispering so softly that only he could hear. "I just wanted a chance to live without fear, to take care of my mother, and maybe one day to open a bakery." The words slipped out like a secret she had held for too long. She almost regretted saying them, afraid he might laugh, afraid others might mock her. But instead the man smiled, not with pity, but with respect. "Then that is what you shall have," he said firmly, his words carrying a power that made everyone in the diner sit straighter. He pulled out one of the envelopes and placed it in front of her. "This will clear every debt you have. Rent, bills, everything," he said. Then he placed another envelope. "This will provide for your mother, her medicine, her comfort, her peace." And finally he tapped the papers in the briefcase. "And this is an investment contract. I will help you open that bakery you dreamed of, not because of pity, but because I believe you will put the same kindness you gave me into every loaf of bread, into every customer who walks through your door." Tears rolled down her cheeks freely now. She tried to shake her head, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I can't accept this. I only gave you food, nothing more. I don't deserve all this." But he gently raised his hand, stopping her. "You gave me more than food. You gave me proof that the world is not empty of compassion. You gave me hope on a night when I needed it most. Do not call that nothing." His voice was steady, almost commanding, yet filled with kindness, the kind of tone that silenced every argument. The manager finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Sir, she is lucky, but perhaps we should—" He stopped when the billionaire's sharp gaze turned to him. The man's voice turned colder as he said, "She is not lucky, she is deserving, and the shame is not hers. It belongs to those who mocked her for her kindness." The words hit the room like a hammer. Several customers lowered their heads, cheeks burning red, remembering their laughter, their whispers, their judgment. The air grew thick with guilt, and the waitress stood there, unable to believe that someone was defending her so fiercely. One of the guards placed the briefcase gently on the counter, as if presenting a crown to a queen. The waitress stared at it, her mind spinning. Her heart beating so fast it felt like it might burst, the thought of her mother smiling without worry, the thought of owning her own bakery, the thought of never walking home in fear of unpaid rent. It all seemed like a dream too bright to be real. She wiped her tears, but they kept falling. Her hands shook as she touched the envelope. The weight of paper felt like the weight of a new life. The other customers whispered now, but this time it was not cruel gossip. It was awe, it was disbelief. It was the sound of people realizing they had witnessed something rare. A story that would spread far beyond the diner. The poor waitress who gave leftovers to a homeless man, and the homeless man who returned as a billionaire to change her life. The story was alive before it even ended. It was already weaving itself into the hearts of everyone present. The waitress finally found her voice, though shaky. She whispered, "Thank you, I don't know how to ever repay you." And the man smiled softly, shaking his head. "You already did. The night you chose kindness over convenience, the night you chose compassion over rules, that was your gift to me. Now this is my gift to you." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and she realized repayment was not what he wanted. What he wanted was for her to continue being who she was. Someone who chose kindness in a world that too often chose cruelty. The diner, once a place of judgment and whispers, was now a place of stunned respect. The waitress stood taller though tears still stained her cheeks. She realized that kindness had not only fed a man but had also fed her own destiny. And as she held the envelopes, as she felt the weight of possibility in her hands, she understood that life was about to change forever, not just because of money, but because someone had shown her that kindness, even when the world mocks it, always comes back, often in ways greater than anyone can imagine. The night after the billionaire left, the waitress walked home slowly, her hands clutching the envelopes he had given her. Her mind still spinning as if everything that happened inside the diner was just a dream. The streets looked the same, the flickering streetlights, the cracked sidewalks, the distant sound of traffic. Yet to her they felt different, brighter somehow. As though life itself had shifted, she had always walked these streets tired and burdened. But now every step carried a new weight, not the weight of worry, but the weight of possibility. In her small rented room she placed the envelopes carefully on the table. She touched them again and again, afraid that they might vanish if she looked away. She thought of her mother, alone in the countryside, worrying every day about medicine and bills, and tears filled her eyes as she realized she could finally send enough money for her mother to live in peace. No more skipping medicine, no more sleepless nights worrying. Her mother would finally smile without fear, and that thought alone made her cry harder, this time not from sadness but from relief. The next morning, when she walked into the diner, the air felt different. People stared at her with wide eyes, but not with judgment like before. This time there was respect. Even awe whispers still filled the air, but they carried a new tone. Words like lucky, blessed, unbelievable floated around the room. The same customers who had once mocked her now lowered their eyes when she passed, ashamed of their cruelty. Others gave her small nods of respect, as though silently apologizing. The waitress carried herself calmly. She still smiled as she served, but inside she felt stronger, no longer invisible, no longer the girl people could laugh at without consequence. The manager tried to act kind too, his voice suddenly polite, offering her easier shifts, asking if she needed anything. But she remembered his harsh words, his warnings, his anger when she gave food to the homeless man. Now that he knew the truth, he wanted to stand by her, but she saw through his sudden sweetness. She answered him politely, but her heart no longer feared him. She knew her future was not tied to this diner anymore. She had something greater waiting for her. Days turned into weeks, and slowly her life began to change. She paid her debts. She sent money to her mother, who cried with joy over the phone, telling her she could finally rest easy. The waitress began to look at empty shops for rent, small places where she dreamed of opening her bakery. The billionaire's promise was not empty. His team guided her through the steps, helped her plan, helped her see that her dream was not just a wish but a future she could touch. Every day she felt herself growing, no longer trapped by survival, but stepping towards something she once thought impossible. The townspeople whispered about her story everywhere, in markets, in bus stops, in shops. People spoke of the poor waitress who fed a homeless man, and how that man returned with bodyguards and revealed himself as a billionaire. Some told it with awe, others with shame, but all agreed it was a story worth remembering. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents retold it. Workers spoke of it during their breaks, and slowly, the lesson spread. Kindness, no matter how small, had the power to echo far beyond what anyone could imagine. For the waitress, life was still humble in many ways. She still woke early, still tied her hair back, still worked hard. But her heart carried something new, a sense of purpose. She realized that her act of kindness had not only changed her life but had touched others. People who once ignored the homeless began offering them food. People who once laughed at kindness now thought twice, because her story showed them that compassion was never wasted. She became an example without ever trying to be one. When her bakery finally opened, it was small but filled with warmth. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the air. The walls were painted in soft colors, and the little bell above the door rang cheerfully whenever a customer entered. She named it after her father, to honor the man who taught her never to let poverty steal her goodness. The bakery became a place not only for food but for comfort. She often slipped an extra roll into the bag of someone who looked tired, or gave a slice of bread to a child who came with no money. She remembered her own days of hunger, and she never forgot the lesson that started it all. The billionaire visited quietly sometimes, not with guards, not with cars, just as a man who came to buy bread and sit for a moment. His eyes always warm when he looked at her. He never spoke loudly of what he had done. He never demanded attention. He only smiled as he watched her living her dream, and every time he left, she whispered a thank you in her heart, not only for the money, not only for the opportunity, but for reminding her that kindness, even when it seems small, can awaken miracles. The townspeople often told her story as if it were a fairy tale, a poor waitress who fed a stranger and gained a fortune. But she always corrected them when they called her lucky. She would smile gently and say, "It was not luck, it was kindness." Because in her heart she believed that the world gives back what you give to it. Sometimes not right away, sometimes in ways you cannot see, but always in ways that matter. And so, her life became proof that even the smallest act could change everything. She did not become proud or arrogant. She remained humble, serving with a smile, baking with love, giving with an open heart. The whispers of judgment were gone, replaced with whispers of respect. Her legacy was not the money or the bakery alone, but the lesson she had shown the world, that kindness costs nothing but can return in ways greater than imagination. At night, when she closed her bakery and sat by the window with a cup of tea, she thought back to that moment in the diner. The night she gave food to a trembling man who only asked for water. She thought of how tired she had been, how afraid of her manager's anger, how the world had laughed, and yet she had chosen to give anyway. She smiled softly as she remembered his eyes, the gratitude, the quiet thank you, and she whispered to herself, that was the night everything changed. A simple act, a simple choice, but one that carried her into a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream.